Yes, and we're live. So, welcome everyone. Episode 16 of the Armory Roundtable. I don't normally do this, but since we're reaching almost 2,000 subscribers, if any of you hasn't yet, this is maybe a good moment to kind of work to that goal. Um, and well, without any further waste of time, because we only have about 1 hour today, I'll introduce the guest of today, or actually, I'll let him introduce himself. He'll probably do a better job. So, Rob Runacres, feel free to let us know a little about yourself, and thank you for joining.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. So yes, I'm Rob Runacres. I'm a historian and I specialise on the early modern period, specifically on fencing, fencers, fencing families, and usually their interactions at royal courts. Um, I got into this really through HEMA, and I hope there's some HEMA people watching. So I've been knocking around in HEMA for getting on for 20 years. And there are several people to blame why I started doing a thesis on this and got into being a historian. Daniel Jacquet and Fabrice Cognot, you know who you are. And mainly it was because I started researching fight books, the treatises that HEMA people used to try and recreate how people fought in the past. There was one particular fight book, which was a French translation of an Italian treatise by a chap called Girolamo Cavalcabo,
Hmm.
who was based in Rome but was originally of Bologna. And the fight book intrigued me because it was very pragmatic. Um, and yet it wasn't particularly celebrated.
Hmm.
Certainly in HEMA times or in the revivals we saw since the 1990s of HEMA, or in the 19th century, where again there was this sort of interest in recreating historical fighting. And yet the fencer allegedly was the teacher of Louis XIII.
Hmm.
And so for some reason there was this disjoint that you had someone who was teaching a prince, later a king,
Hmm.
and yet really in more recent history, the Italians didn't seem to want to know about him so much because obviously there's a vast amount of Italian fencing treatises. And also possibly because he's most well known through a French translation. French fencers were perhaps arguably more interested in the French side of things and didn't really want to know about an Italian who was translated into French. So I started picking at this, and Fab and Daniel, and also mate Thibaut Guesquier, really encouraged me to keep researching into this. And I started learning a little bit more and a little bit more, and I thought I really wanted to do a PhD on this. Partly because I really wanted to get into the detail of what was going on here and to perhaps learn more widely what it took to train a prince. What do you actually do? How do you teach a boy who's also, we could call him a valuable asset? He's a very sort of
Hmm.
delicate asset in some ways. How do you teach someone to fight, but you can't sort of bash them about with the training sword? You have, how do you impart this knowledge, and what use was this knowledge to a prince? I also did the thesis incidentally because doing a thesis is the crucible. It's really, if you want, to be put through the ringer to try and do some
Hmm.
research, then do the thesis, and that's basically why I got into it, and it's just opened up a whole world for me on that side of things. So yeah, that's basically how I got into this area.
Interesting. And was it easy to bring, like, to have your thesis supervised or followed in the sense that it seems like a very, very niche? I mean, most PhD theses, I guess, are niche, but this one especially feels like it's a niche within a niche. So,
Well, I was very, very fortunate because I sent out a load of blind emails, and some people said, no, it ain't us. Some people said, well, you know, five books, we know all about them now, which I think various HEMA people would be thoroughly insulted by.
mm,
And but eventually, a wonderful historian called Ellie Whitaker of the University of Winchester saw this, and she is very much in charge of court studies, and she saw something in this about, okay, fencing's not really been talked about in court studies on this angle. And she got in contact with Jonathan Spangler, who's up in Manchester University. They're two American academics, actually. And they were really interested because fencing at court had not really been touched upon. And actually, there's very, very few biographies of fencers as well. It's something I'm talking about in a conference coming up, in that we know a lot about the treatises, and there's been a lot of work, and there's still a lot of work on interpretation, but the lives behind the written record, as were, is still relatively unknown. There's some good ones on people like Louis Pacheco, Jacques Thibault d'Anvers, and people like that. There's some good stuff, but in general, drilling down on fencers, their families, isn't really known, and that's interesting to me, because that affects how you fence, of course, the personality behind. We're seeing in a treatise, I suppose, a perfect rendition of an art. It's very much what is wanted to be conveyed, but the actual fences themselves, in some ways, remains a mystery. So they took me under their wing, dealt with all of my nonsense, and guided me through, along with some brilliant PhD colleagues.
Cool. So we will dive, I think, into the Louis XIII as the subject, let's say, of your thesis, and as the subject of the royal training
Yeah.
by excellence, let's say. But then maybe let's talk first about the fencer teacher. What do we know about him? And
So we know it was a guy called Cesare Cavalcabo. He was of the Cavalcabo family that we mentioned already, and he started teaching the Dauphin, Louis, the heir to the throne, in 1609. And he had a very successful career there. He went on and taught Gaston d'Orléans, the brother of Louis XIII, from 1615, and he continued on to 1628, when he left the French court, and he died some years later. We don't have an awful lot of information specific to the lessons, mainly because of something I'm going to come on to, which is a bit of an antagonism, if you will, a pull between those who are interested in princes learning very much letters, we'll call it an academic side of things, that's a bit of a loose term, and those who are more interested in the prince learning the physical side of things. And it might actually be worth talking a little bit about that as a background now, before we talk more about Louis XIII.
Absolutely.
So in this period, you're starting to see this idea of how a prince should be. And historians to date have very much felt that in the early modern period, the prince is starting to become more symbolic when it comes to action, rather than participating in battles and combat. They're getting away from the ideas of the joust, the tournament, the active participation. And there's some good reason for thinking this. For a start, a lot of the books that are coming out at the time are very much etiquette books, and how a prince should be, how they should be a good Christian ruler. And generally the people writing this are those who are people of letters themselves, so it's their interest. They're not interested in the fighting side. There's also been some accidents. Henry II of France is famously killed in a joust. You've had a few duels where things have gone wrong. The Jarnac duel, where someone bleeds to death, and there's an idea that people should be moving away to a more refined, non-combative side of things. And so the historians to date, yes, go on.
Sorry to interrupt you, but Henry VIII himself gets injured, right?
Yes, indeed, he's injured. And he's very famous for being a wrestler. He famously wrestles Francis I on the field of the Cloth of Gold. Loses badly, probably hated it immensely. But from that point onwards, there's this idea that they're not doing so much, or they shouldn't be doing so much. Part of this is down to a guy called Erasmus of Rotterdam, who's a humanist, and he was horrified by the Pope's final takeover of Bologna in 1506. The papacy had owned Bologna, or at least had control of Bologna for some time, but Bologna had been in and out of the papal control. He'd also been horrified by, I think, Henry VIII going into France and stuff like that. And he wrote this this book, basically about the education of Christian prince and how a prince should be a more godly person, should do away with all of these, this physical stuff that's going on. Now, this has been focused on a lot by historians, and one of the contentions in my thesis is, well, actually, the martial side of stuff does continue onwards later into the 17th century. Louis XIII, very interested in the martial side of things. Henry Frederick, who was the Prince of Wales for James I, he actually died quite young. He was really going to be the great Protestant warrior king. He was absolutely, he was really, his almost his academy was a military academy in some ways. And of course, you've got Gustav Adolf of Sweden, dies in Lutzen, in a charge, stuff like that. The princes and the kings at this time still had the idea, in many instances, not in all instances, but in many instances, of fulfilling a warrior kingship. There's one historian has described Louis as becoming a cavalier king rather than knight king. So there is a transition. So much of what I looked on was that, and what I was finding was that a lot of the guidebooks, if you will, of the time, princely guidebooks, are recommending that princes are also educated in combat. So Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, he's the father of Charles V, who of course becomes a very big emperor who's looking after the Low Countries and Spain, as well as his Habsburg territories. Maximilian I, the father, writes a book called the Weisskönig, and it's this sort of fantasy book, but it's semi-autobiographical. And there's a long section on it on learning combat as part of the princely art, and that's written between 1506 and 1515. Much later, James I of England, who we've mentioned already, he writes a guidebook for his sons, which is called Basilican Doron. It's a wonderful term. And in it, he says, horsemanship, absolutely vital. You must know how to joust. Fencing is very, very important, these physical arts. And he actually downplays some of the more academic side of things. James is saying, you need to be you don't need to be an expert in all these things. You need to know enough to rule. And it's these wonderful guidebooks are going out saying you need to know the martial as well as the letters. Naturally, these things are more complicated than we can discuss in the time allocated. James was famous, for avoiding warfare, and he had some conflict with Henry Frederick, who was very much interested in taking it to the Catholics and stuff like this. But there is I would say, throughout the 16th century, you see with things like the Courtier by Castiglione, these guidebooks are saying, yes, you need to know letters. Yes, you should be all-rounded, but you need the physical side as well. Indeed, and I hope I'm not bopping around over too many subjects here, but in the Courtier by Castiglione, he mentions Pietromonte, who was a very famous soldier at the beginning of the 16th century, wrote this massive rambling tome on exercise and combat as well. So the HEMA side of things, the fight book, are, in my opinion, really quite front and center of what would be noble and princely education. So
Interesting.
Yeah, so when we get to Louis XIII, you've got really quite an established process of how a prince should be trained. There's a lot of arguments between the authors. There is a push and pull between them. It's worth checking out someone called Vigiani, who writes a book on combat, which is originally in a beautiful manuscript, is eventually published by his brother in 1575. But the first two books are a big discussion about what's more noble, letters or combat. And of course, it comes down to combat being that. But it's actually reflective of a lot of the conversations that's happening at the court of Philip I, Philip II as well, and across the courts of Europe. And these courts are all talking to each other. So when we talk about Louis XIII and his princely education. It's not isolated. It's not coming out of a specific French thing. Italian courts are doing it. We've already heard about the Holy Roman Empire. The Spanish courts are doing this. Their children are learning. The boys are learning combat. The English courts doing it, or the Anglo-Scot courts at that time. So there seems to be a, by the time we're talking about Louis, we're talking about a reasonable idea that, combat, horsemanship, in particular combat, and as well being able to ride a horse, as well as combat, as well as learning letters are as important.
Okay. And do you think this is attempt to blend the old, maybe more medieval view of the king or the leader as a part in battle, let's say, or is it a new phenomenon that kind of arises? It still sees the leader or the king as a combatant or someone who needs to know how to fight, but it's kind of a new thing that is born, let's say, around the 1500s.
Well, it's a big argument that's coming on. I mean, certainly from the early 1500s onwards, you see these books, lots of conversations, and people argue through their books. They obviously can't meet on Zoom or whatever and have a row. So they're publishing these things. There's great concern about the prince endangering themselves. There's a number of French authors who are very concerned the prince should not be putting themselves in danger. But at the same time, it's quite contradictory. They're saying, but they have to lead armies. And I think this is where some of the ideas about how a king should be in image a leader rather than actuality come about. But I do wonder if the example of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the great centralization of power, he's got, you see all of this wonderful ceremony that goes on. I wonder if that's retrospectively applied to the earlier part of the century. And the reason why I say that is you've got Henry Frederick, who wants to be the warrior king. He dies because he overdoes it. He goes swimming. He's been told, don't do it so much, but he goes swimming, gets the fever, and he dies. And there's a very interesting continuation what happens there. Louis XIII is the son of Henry IV. Henry IV is a great warrior king. He's united France after years and years of very bloody civil wars. He's still dealing with fighting during the early part of his reign. He's dealing with fighting the Spanish as well. And Louis wants to be dad. So whilst we've got all these etiquette books or these guidebooks, if you will, about, should the prince be the warrior? Should he not be the warrior? Louis wants to be his dad. He wants to be a warrior. And, as I said, you've got Henry Frederick wants to be the great warrior. Later on in the century, interesting, there's a guy called Balthazar Carlos. I think, forgive me, I think he's the son of Philip III or IV. I can't remember. Sorry, guys. But he also is presented as wanting to be, he really wants to be the great warrior. So this idea of being a warrior prince, some of what the writers are writing about saying now we don't really want that. In the minds of the warriors, they do kind of, actually, sorry, the minds of the kings, of the princes, they want to do that. Louis got a problem though. He is ill. He is repeatedly sick. And some people said he's got Crohn's disease. Other people who said he's got various sort of intestinal disease that's going on. He's repeatedly ill. And what's fascinating with Louis is he takes to fencing very much. He's good at fencing. He's commented on as being good at fencing. He loves shooting. He shoots everything that walks or crawls. He trains with the pike. He trains with the halberd. He's very much into it. But he's ill, and he gets sick. He gets bedridden. Not too bedridden that he's not able to go out the window and shoot at any passing things that go on. It's quite funny in my mind on that. But he's unable to train a lot of times physically. And then when he gets better, he forces himself to train again, and it becomes a cycle. And eventually, Richelieu, when he comes along, has to, I believe, kind of put the mockers on this and go, look, you can't continue to do this. So again, we've got this idea, partly from Dumas and the Three Musketeers, of this sort of weak, feeble, easily led king, and to a degree, the tragedy of his childhood and the death of his father at a young age, and the fact he wasn't loved as he became, which is a whole other story, means that he does attach to favorites. But he wants to be the warrior, and he forces himself to do it. So again, this idea of we're not quite in the medieval period with being the tournament guy, though he did tilt at the ring. And he is there's a guy called Antoine de Pluvinel who taught him how to ride, taught him mounted combat with swords and to tilt with the lance. So he does learn this, but it's still it's not quite at the Louis XIV idea of being quite separated and being more of the image of the king. It's if I'm sitting on the fence, it's, I have to say, because I'm still not quite decided, and there's still a lot of work to do on this.
Okay, cool. So in the meantime, I'll just quickly say hi to Julian Ronenberger, who's joining today as well, and Philippe Simondi. They both are always here. So hi, guys. And I'll also maybe remind everyone that since we have 1 hour today, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments right away so we have time to address them. So Louis XIII, though, does also become maybe not a warrior king, but he does get very involved in military campaigns. So does he do this personally, in a sense, or to what extent is he involved in warfare, or to what extent is he just the formal leader of the French forces?
It's a good question. So martially, he does get involved. The problem we've got is the bulk of his early life is recorded by a guy called Irois, Dr. Irois, and he was the physician to the king. And Irois's nose was massively out of joint. He wanted to be the preceptor, the main tutor of Louis, and he doesn't get it. What Louis's dad did is quite funny. He gets a guy called Yvetot, who taught Henry's illegitimate son. And Henry thought it was a great idea to get the tutor of his illegitimate son to teach Louis as well. This caused a massive row with the Queen, who was very upset that his rivals coming along and doing that. Yvetot, incidentally, probably got the job because he supplied Henry love poetry when Henry was riding off on his various amorous conquests. But anyway, Irois is very, very fed up that he's not this, and so a lot of the martial side of Louis's endeavors are pushed down. He doesn't insult Louis, but he's quite dismissive of a lot of Louis's teachers. He doesn't really talk about cavalcabo. And he basically, when Louis is doing things, so Louis goes out and trains with his petit gens, the other boys at court, and they learn to train with a pike, and they learn to build forts, earth forts, and that. And Irois basically says, "Oh, he's playing with mud pies. It's silly, he's getting out in the rain. He's getting wet. He's going to be ill again," which of course he does. But this is training for Louis. He's learning all this stuff, and when you take these little excerpts with some of the other things, you know that he's training. Now, soon after he finishes his education, he's going out on campaign. Now he's dealing with some of those Huguenots, the Protestants, stuff like that, and he's going out on campaign. He also previously, whilst he was still in the regency of his mother, I think it's Rouen he goes to, and he looks at building forts. He's getting actively involved in practical fort building.
And that is at a really young age, because the regency is up to his 14th year old.
So he's a little bit older than that. I mean, he's you've got basically Marie de Medici, who he's got this tortuous relationship with, and he's got his favorites that come along as well, various people. So he's never, I don't know if he's ever fully in control until he's much older, but certainly during this time he's going out and he is doing these things. And then when he's got the kingship, when he overthrows his mother eventually, he goes out on these campaigns. But as I said, he gets ill, and that's what's curtailing it. Interestingly, and just as an aside, he gets ill. I don't want people to think that he just becomes this image of things. Richelieu, right the way through his kingship, talks with Louis advice about military matters. And even Louis's detractors said he was good at dressing a lie, he knew how to organize troops, and he knew about organization. And even near his death, he was sending out notes telling off his nobles, you haven't got enough armor, you should have the right army, you should be supplying this. So even if he has to come back in the more active side of military things, he's still engaged in getting involved with the military.
So we can assume his combat training blossomed.
It did. I mean, I personally think that it was illness and the psychological problems that he had held him back. He's an interesting guy. He's an interesting tutee for Cavalcabot. He actually stabs Cavalcabot in the eye in 1611, I think. Yeah, so it's anyone who's taught fencing may know this. But they're using florets, they're using blunted florets, but they don't have masks at the time. And at one point, Cavalcabot is adjusting the king's foot. Now, why Louis did this, we don't know, but Louis stabs him in the eye. Now, it may be because Louis had a very short temper. It may be because there's a physical interaction and Cavalcabot is adjusting the foot physically. We don't know. But that may have crossed a line for Louis. You don't touch the person of the king. Only certain people do. More humorously, the night before, he stabs a guy called Monsieur de Saintonge in the eye with a spear of asparagus at dinner. And Saintonge was possibly Cavalcabot's student. He actually went on to, if it's the same Saintonge, he went on to teach Louis XIV how to fence. So there's a theme going on here. But Louis does engage in this stuff. A little bit later, the English ambassador compliments him on his fencing, and to agree, we have to go, maybe this is all just being sycophantic, but it's in a report of a letter, and generally, a lot of the letters are going to be quite accurate. These are reports. They don't want to embellish this too much. Louis also learns the sword and shield. As I said, he's going in formation with the halberd and the spear as well as with the musket. He prefers shooting because he's good at it, and I think due to his disabilities, it's easier for him. But during some times when there were concerns about Condé, one of the French grandees, causing a rebellion, Louis wants to stand guard. He wants a halberd. He wants to get involved. So he is actively involved in this. And again, we have to be quite delicate with the Journal of Illois, as I said, because it is biased. It's downplaying a lot of these things. But for Louis, he wants to get involved.
Yeah, it's interesting how the same activity can be interpreted as playing with mud or building forts and military, like training on military structures. So,
well, this is what's interesting as well when you look just on that, if I may. When you look at Henry Frederick, he's training with the pike. And this is about the time when, the Lord fighting on foot in England, with his companions is seen as a very positive thing. For the French, it's generally the cavalry is seen as that side.
Yeah.
There's none of the same sort of how would you put it? There's people are not making bad comments about Henry Frederick. They're praising him for being this great warrior because he's so noble. He fights at the barriers with his men, so he's fighting with blunted weapons. Modern historians say fighting at the barriers, which is obviously a tournament type thing, is it's not really like combat. Well, no, but if you've ever done fencing, being hit round the head by a sword, it's not necessarily a soft option either. Henry Frederick's getting involved. There's none of the negativity around him, and he's training at the same time as Louis, who is playing with mud pies.
Yes, well, also it's interesting that they use pikes, I suppose, in the sense that you would think that is a kind of weapon more for the masses, in a sense. So the king training with that rather than training in a even symbolic leadership position, maybe? Is it a little unusual, or would it be expected?
No, actually, I mean, there's an excellent manual by, fight book by someone called Pistofilo, who talks about
Hmm.
individual training with a pike, and other fight book authors do talk about this, and lots of different pole arms. And you have
Hmm.
to learn as an individual. I will have to defer to other HEMA experts than this, but certainly you could learn it and did learn it as an individual. But yes, you
Okay.
would then go
Yeah.
on to train in formation.
Okay. And when it comes to, which I think probably most Hemists will be the most interested in, but when it comes to the fencing, what is Louis using? What techniques? What is he being taught?
So we know he was definitely using a sword. Now we're going to have to infer that it is a sword of the period,
Hmm.
1600 to 1620 or 1590 to 1620. Um, the issue we get is typologies have tended to look at things through an evolutionary advancement. And if I can just self-promote, I've got an article coming out soon actually on the typologies and the evolution of the rapier. Now, Cavalcabo, the treatise of Girolamo Cavalcabo of the Cavalcabo family, is what would be broadly called nowadays a side sword. It uses a lot of the point, but it also uses cutting. Um, we I get very uncomfortable when we try and really nail down, oh, it's side sword versus rapier. We get into a lot of trouble. And then we get into,
Hmm.
well, it's early rapier versus mid rapier. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, but it's not an exact thing here. But I'd
Yeah.
certainly say um, I would imagine that Henry IV is going to be a reasonable traditionalist. He's going to want something that is more combat based necessarily than purely demonstrative. That being said, the king has to show that he's got skill. Now, fight books are a very interesting thing. They are in many ways a codification of a martial art. When you codify something, in some ways you make it esoteric to a degree.
Hmm.
Um, for a start, if you put it down in writing, you are limiting it to those people who can read or those who have access to people who can read to them. We can't see a fight book necessarily as something that directly translates into being taught. People weren't reading the books and learning from them. And in Paris during this period, out of the 75 fencers that I know about from the archives, only one of them wrote a book. And that was
Hmm.
Salvatore Fabris, who was passing through at the time. So it doesn't really count. So I would say he's probably going to be learning something along the lines of what Cavalcabo had written. Cavalcabo's treatise goes into new edition 6 times. It's reprinted 6 times throughout the period Cavalcabo is there. It's also translated into
Successful.
German. Yeah, it appears in the Book of Lessons, which is an anonymous treatise, and it's also referenced in a French book in parts in the 1660s. So it's popular for the period, but it kind of isn't really reprinted after
Mm.
the late 1620s. But I would hazard that he's learning that. So he's learning a foot-based sword. We know he's taught by Antoine de Pluvinel. Antoine de Pluvinel posthumously had a book called Manières Royales, and another more expansive book as well, which details it talks about Louis' training, but as a guide for wider training. And we know that um, there are shorter swords used for mounted combat. There's
Mhm.
there are some letters of the period as well that are very interesting that talk about the dimensions of the sword. They have to be shorter for mounted combat because you have to draw the sword over your bridle. You have to also make sure it's not stolen from you. You don't want it catching in your horse's legs. And
Mhm.
these are actually shown in Pluvinel's treatise, and Louis is shown in full armor doing a game with these swords. Though to be quite clear, Pluvinel is less interested in the mechanics of sword fighting in the books as
Mhm.
much as saying about how you turn the horse after you've passed someone and given a strike. But
Mhm.
nonetheless, we can have and I just want to talk about Pluvinel a sec because it does say a lot about princely instruction. Now, we've mentioned earlier about how the academics, the letters people, are very interested in the letters. Pluvinel recommends this for his academy. Now, he reckons that riding is the most important, but he says the most important things are a fencing instructor, a dancing instructor, a vaulter, so learning to vault, a mathematician, mainly for learning the mathematics of fortifications, and also a man of letters as the teaching staff. Now, he said that on the timetable, riding and tilting at the ring would happen every day, 7 days a week.
Wow.
Fencing, dancing, and vaulting and mathematics would occur every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons alone will be for learning your Latin, Italian, your letters. Now, Pluvinel is teaching the king. He actually teaches Louis from, I think, 1615 onwards at his academy. And he is, this is a template which I believe is broadly copied at a number of courts. So again, we're seeing that fencing after riding is really, really important. And Louis is learning this.
Interesting. And we also see that, yeah, letters and Latin have definitely lost the battle in which discipline is the most important.
And again, what's interesting is Louis learning, he has 4 hours of lessons for about 5 days a week in his first few years. Now, the problem is for Louis, the terrible thing for Louis is his father's assassinated and he has to become a king, albeit in name during the regency. So he takes on these ceremonial duties. But part of those 4 hours are also the dancing and the fencing. Now, some historians have said, these interfered with his lessons. Well, actually, when you look at what Pluvinel's talking about, this template, no. These are integral to his lessons. This is what he should be learning about. Incidentally, Henry Frederick, who's very good at Latin, annoyingly, he's doing less hours a day and less time during the week.
Okay.
Louis is ill. Louis, got temper tantrums. He's got a very weird family. I mean, he has a very unhappy childhood. So in many ways, it's quite a miracle he gets to adulthood.
Yes, you did mention having to usurp your mother, which I think is a
He did.
situation most of us can't
Yeah. I
relate
mean,
to.
if it's not too much of a digression, when Louis was an infant, he was seen as gorging himself. And so the doctor recommended 3 incisions in the tongue. So he's a baby and they cut his tongue. And that gave him a lisp for life. He's also ill. His mother didn't like him. She preferred the younger brother. His father openly preferred his illegitimate half brother and then assassinated. This is a messed up family. So his enthusiasms, which are played down by Iwa, as we talked about, and that in many ways his escape. So he's got a lisp. He doesn't move very well because he's very ill. But probably he's a superb rider. But then this is why all these criticisms come about the image of the king. So for him to fulfill the military image of the king has got lots of impediments from the word go.
That's, well, a credit to his stamina, I guess, and motivation. We'll quickly say hi to Sam Parker from New Orleans. So thank you for joining. And also, I think this is really interesting because maybe from the outside, if I think of fencing for future king at the, let's say, onset of the modern era, I think about an activity that's more pleasurable, a little, in a sense, not as intense as you're describing it now. Whereas, let's say, 4 hours a day, 7 days a week riding, this is high intensity martial arts training, let's say, and meant for use. So I find this quite eye-opening, I think.
Well, Louis got a problem. The French, the princes, the blood for a start, and also the senior nobility are unruly. And one of the things when we talk about the image of the prince is, yes, they've got to demonstrate fencing. They've got to show that they could do it, but they've got to demonstrate to an expert audience. And these are people who are actively engaged in fighting. They may be leading armies, they may be leading rebellions as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it was simply a show, if it was purely choreography, there is choreography involved, by the way, I'm not trying to deny that, but if it's purely that, I feel it would be commented on by some of the anti-royalist texts, and I think it would backfire quite badly. You had to be able, your deportment, the fashioning of the body was extremely important. We've also got a crossover that a lot of fencing masters were also dancing masters. So the fencing master of Charles IX, the Valois, was called Pompey. It was actually Pompeo Diabono, who was a very famous dancing instructor. Now, some of his students had dancing and fencing schools in Milan and in Rome. And I think we have to be careful again of going, well, it's all choreography, it's it's not real. Frenchmen are still going to France to Italy to learn how to fight from Italian masters. Italian fencing masters are in vogue, but it's not simply a vogue. They're deemed to have something that's useful as well as demonstrable. And there's a guy called Stuart Carroll who's written a wonderful book called Blood and Violence in Early Modern France. And he talks a lot about the myth of the duel, but a lot about the violence that was going on in the period and continues to go through. And I think anyone listening to this should also look at something called Croisé de Fer by 3 French authors. And they talk about the dueling carrying on into the 18th and 19th century in France. It doesn't really disappear. It just transforms into how it's termed. It becomes encounters and stuff like that. So you have a culture where fencing is understood and there are experts. It couldn't simply be that everyone rocks up and claps politely. The king or the prince prancing about.
Interesting. Yeah. It feels like it draws a direct line from what we were mentioning before from older times, that having to prove yourself as the king. And this, now that you're mentioning even 19th century dueling, it's like a direct lineage of a martial culture where you can't just, as you say, expect the applause, but you need to earn it in a sense.
Sure. I mean, certainly the king by that time is not getting involved in combat. Napoleon aside, let's talk about the Bourbons. And it does become far more of a pastime, of a sport for various people. So talking about princely culture rather than wider fencing, which I was alluding to there, certainly it's becoming a pastime. But I think it's something where if we look at again some of the modern history, I don't want to knock the modern historians too much because hopefully I'm one of them, but they're concentrating on certain things. But fencing has been portrayed as either to the death, very violent, very fast, stuff like that, or pure choreography. Well, you've got a lot of different layers in between, and sometimes you see that even though people were fighting in a violent context, they had to demonstrate skill. It wasn't just brutality. There was more going on there in terms of what people at the time found acceptable.
We have a couple of comments now based on what we're talking about, so we'll dive into them. So Phil Simondi says, I'm no royalty, but I remember taking dancing classes while already practicing épée fencing, and I could feel some overlaps in terms of skills involved, tempo coordination, steps. I think this is, at least in the little bit of fencing I did, it was drilled in from the start that footwork is the core of like the frame on which you build everything else. So do you want to add on to that, Rob?
Yes, indeed. I'm just looking at some notes at the moment. So one of the things that's interesting is this guy Henry Frederick, Henry IV. We got a lot of Henrys at the time, and I apologise on their behalf. But Henry IV, Louis's dad, sends Henry Frederick a riding master, a fencing master, and a dance master. So a lot of the times they are put together. And there is a lot of overlap, and indeed, just looking at my notes now, you do get these dancers who are very much involved in fencing as well. There's a little bit of push and pull. Some dancers are going, some fencers are saying, don't confuse fencing with a dance. That's dangerous. That's a very bad way of doing things. I'm just actually looking up, though. There is a dancer, a Spanish dancer, who I'll try and find, who really felt that that fencing was very, very important. I can't find it just yet. I'll shout if I find it. But yes, certainly there's overlaps, and absolutely, it teaches core mechanics. And that's really important. You need core mechanics. And again, you've got to remember that when the king enters the hall, he's moving in a certain way, and he is the focus of attention. He can't stagger and slouch his way through. So core mechanics, that movement, is integral.
Interesting. And we have a comment from Julian. I remember having seen these timetables for the Dukes of Saxony, which had an early court and a more modern court sense as well. If you think that stationary courts are relatively young. So I'd be curious, Julian, if your memory of these timetables overlap or match what Rob was saying about Louis XIII. But interesting to know that so many timetables survived. I'm quite surprised, actually.
Yes, I mean, you get this in the Spanish court as well, certainly for Philip II, I think, but certainly Philip III and IV. You get quite a good understanding of their timetables as well. And fencing masters, being a fencing instructor at court is really the top. It's very much what fencing masters are wanting to do. And I think that's something we need to understand about fight books. Is they're not, a lot of times we see them, we look at them, oh right, they're my guide, I can pick it up now, and now I can fence like that person, they're doing that. But for the fencing master at the time, they're either being patronized to do this by someone, famously Christian IV, Salvatore Fabris, loads of other people as well, or they're using it to gain patronage. And something to look at is the dedication at the beginning of the book. Now, a lot of times these dedications seem just sycophantic, but they're not. They have a very particular text, and they are trying to get patronage, or they're trying to basically force someone into patronage. Or, as I say, they are confirming, they're reflecting glory upon the patron. But talking about princes, a guy called Mendoza, I think he was the one who dedicated his treatise to this guy, Balthazar Carlos, who was a prince, a Spanish prince. And again, it was, I want to teach the prince. I want to get in there and teach them. So the timetables, there's a lot of information, untapped information, to look at how princes were taught. And also there are a lot of fencing masters trying to get in on the game. In fact, I have just found that, if you're interested, I've just found that it's Juan de Esquivel Navarro, I apologize to any Spanish people of 1642, who says there have been very few who dance who have not frequented arms, because as they are diligent and quick on their feet and strong in their legs, and these such become capable more quickly than he who does not know how to dance. And for this reason I consider dancing and the game of arms brothers, because both things in a subject go hand in hand very well. So yeah, there's definitely an overlap. Yeah. The thing I would say, and I can't remember the quote exactly, is dancing requires coordination with a partner. Fencing requires coordination with a partner. But as this quote goes, you have to make their music sound bad whilst yours sounds good. You have to wrong foot them. And in the end, someone has to fail.
Yeah, that's a nice quote for sure. When we talk about princely fencing, then it's obviously designed around one person. It's the peak or the pinnacle of the art. But is it a pinnacle that comes, let's say, that is built from the ground up in a sense. So it takes in from the collective experience of fencing, and then it kind of distills the best for the prince, or is it more something that spills down onto the rest of the population in terms of new techniques or new ways of fighting?
That's a really interesting question. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the pinnacle, because the fencing master is represented by their students, and if the student's not that good or has limited time, you can't say that. It's interesting to note that not all, again, I said we tend to look at the fight books. Not all of those people are the ones who become court fencers. You get there through recommendation, luck, all of those things, but you have to be good at what you do. Certainly Salvatore Fabris, who's the fencing master of Christian IV of Denmark, was arguably the superstar of the time. He was the David Bowie. He was a bit of a naughty boy as well, which I can go into another time. But it was a big prize getting him to court. And he taught Christian to fence. Allegedly, Christian claims that he taught him Italian as well. At least Christian, whilst drunk, said that to a captive audience once. But he was the pinnacle. And we've got to remember that Fabris, his art is taken on very much in the German-speaking areas, well into the 18th century. It continues on and on and on. And he's actually hounded by autograph hunters as well. He has quite an interesting life. So that is the pinnacle, and it does go downwards. And a lot of people react against Fabris as well. Monesi, who is a Florentine, Alfieri, who was from Padua. They say, well, it's good, but there are problems with Fabris. Thibaut d'Anvers says, okay, Thibaut is very, very good. He gets a lot of things right, but in many things he errs. Now, it may have been that Thibaut's book was actually sponsored by other courts to have a go at Fabris. You've got this little war between courts through their patronage. And so, yes, it is the pinnacle, and you do see these distillations going down. For Cavall Cabot, you see these books being reprinted a lot. They're in wide distribution. And it wouldn't surprise me if people are wanting to fence like the king, because obviously it's good for patronage and stuff like that. But it's also, well, hold on, if it's good enough for the king, it's good enough for me. So it's probably true that there is some distillation downwards. Whether it's the pinnacle of the arts is a really interesting question. We've got to remember our lens on the past is on the fight books. So who's popular then isn't necessarily who's popular now.
And as you mentioned, yes, a lot of reprints, but it also declines quickly because by the 1660s, if I remember correctly, it's already out of mention, or so.
It certainly doesn't seem to be used as much. And you start to see French authors coming through. You see a guy called Charles Bernard, who's 1653, and he, he's doing something which some people have thought is getting towards the small sword. I'm not sure if I entirely agree with that, but you start to see people like Liancourt and towards the end of the century that things are starting to change, and partly it may be actually that the French Masters of Arms legislation is passed by the French Parliament, supported by the kings eventually. The French Masters of Arms and that start to take control, and you can't have foreigners in France teaching fencing. And so Saint-Ange, who was actually St. Angelo, he was originally an Italian. He's naturalized, he gets French citizenship, and he joins them. He becomes essentially the last non-French royal fencer. And so maybe that reflection is also because you start to see a strong French school coming through. Again, I'm not such a fan of the term of schools to be applied backwards into the 17th and 16th century, because that's born a lot from some of the nationalistic writing that happens in the 19th century. So we've got to be careful. But yeah, that seems to be what's happening. in my opinion.
Okay, I'll quickly remind everyone that we're in the last about 5 minutes of Rob's time. So if you have questions, this is your moment to ask
I can
them.
probably stay on for a few more minutes if that's
Okay,
okay. Yeah.
perfect. Absolutely. So you think that this decline is due to, let's say, political reasons in a sense? So the shift to French, the need for French royal fencers rather than a shift in technique, let's say, or in way of fencing?
More research is needed, which if you ever
Hmm.
talk to a historian is the I don't know way.
Exactly.
So, I mean, you see a decline in a lot of the Italians at court. It's probably due to the legacy of Marie de Medici. You start to see a centralization under Louis XIV, certainly post, Regency. There's a desire to have French fencers rather than Italian fencers. It's not to say that Italian fencers are still not popular. I mean, you look at Angelo in the 18th century, he's on the Georgian court. So you do see this going on. You start to see a change towards lighter swords. Rapiers are still used quite late, but you start to see these lighter swords coming in and the rise of the small sword type weapon. I think there has been historically this idea that everyone drops their rapier about 1660 and picks up a small sword and goes woohoo, and that's I think really been fundamentally changed. But certainly you're seeing a nascent French school growing there, and I would suggest it's because in the 1640s, you're starting to see the centralization of the French masters there. They've got legislation on their side. They've got royal patronage, so they're starting to take over. And generally, when you've got these associations or guilds, you start to codify what's used.
Hmm.
But
And out
I'm
of
I'm
this,
not an expert on this area, so I would defer to those who are, later
hmm.
17th century historians.
And I don't want to put you on the spot on another question out of your expertise, maybe, but when you go to the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, there's a whole room of royal armors
Mm.
for a lot of the kings and everything. Do we see, in the same way as we see a transition, let's say, from kind of a more military use of the sword into, let's say, the small sword? Is that matched even on the equipment and gear we see for the kings, or?
That's a work in progress. And the
Hmm.
reason why I say that is one of the things I was considering, but I haven't gone into much detail on, is pole arms and certainly certain offhand weapons like bucklers, shields, and so on start to decline in the fight books towards the end of the 16th century. Now, they don't disappear. It's wrong to think that fight books don't have them, but you start to see them separate out. You see a number of authors still touch on polearms, but you see an increasing tendency towards, I am being quite cautious with this, towards the single sword and then the sword and dagger, sword and cape, and
Hmm.
maybe something like the targa, and maybe there's an allusion to some other weapons. But generally, that seems to be the fashionable stuff. Military treatises, though, still continue. And what I don't know is does the tuition of pole arms reflect a tendency towards it's seen as a more military thing? Is this just a literary change? Are the books simply changing and some authors are going, okay, this seems to be more interesting for a certain clientele, readership. I'm going to concentrate more on this. We're talking about the writing of fencing, not necessarily the history of fencing,
Hmm.
or sorry, the history of writing fencing we're talking about. So again, I don't know. I would refer you back to what I said earlier about Louis complaining in the 1640s that the French are not using, French nobility are not supplying enough armor. I think some of the comments on the military revolution in this period are quite difficult when it comes to armor. During the English Civil War, armor was used increasingly less, but you still get the cuirassiers, Hezerig's lobsters and stuff like that, as they were known. They're still used. Um, what I would say is I think it's a slower transition than some people say. Again, people start to say, all right, I'm still reading in some modern stuff that knights in armor effectively die with the Battle of Pavia.
Hmm.
And That's nonsense. That's just complete nonsense. They are being used, they're being trained actively well into the 17th century and beyond.
Yeah.
So Louis is still getting armors. He's getting a lot of Milanese armor that's being gifted to him. Again, part of his training would have been wearing armor. We talked before we came on about using harness whilst it's hot.
Yeah.
They'd have been trained on how to do that. So it's still integral. It's still
Yeah,
integral.
which for a sickly king would be quite the
Yeah,
achievement because yeah.
absolutely. Henry Frederick again at the barriers, he would have been fighting in armor. So there, you're sweating away, you're carrying kit. And I think there has been a tendency to look at the barriers and the tournaments as becoming more and more refined. I don't know whether it's because there are more rules because of injuries. It might be a more
Mhm.
practical thing. There's a wonderful guy called Yasin Soriadias, who's a curator at the Royal Armouries, who I'd definitely recommend you talk to about this. He'd
Okay.
be able to opine on it more. But armour is still being used well into the mid 17th century.
Mm. So, with all of these complexities we've mentioned so far, so personal life, political, technological developments, it's a very complicated time. What's the legacy, let's say, of these royal fencers in terms of their effect, let's say, on maybe kings, but then as a consequence on society, let's say?
Wow, it's not a small question.
No, sorry.
No, I mean, I think sometimes we talk about lost martial arts, and I'm not sure how lost things are, because if you look at some of the literature throughout the 18th and 19th century, they're referring back to earlier authors of the 16th and 17th century. So I think that's still there. Um, I think, fencing masters are still used certainly by the English royalty and the French royalty, well, into the 19th century. Um, I must apologise. I'm not too aware of other areas. I'd be very interested to hear on that. Fencing is seen as a core exercise throughout the 17th century. You've got one of our problems is we tend to look at violence in this time, or we see it as choreography. And again, fencing as a sport is perhaps something that could be investigated more during this period, though there are some interesting works coming out on that. People who aspire to nobility, merchant classes, middle classes, they're sending their children to noble academies. They are wanting to get the education. They're aspiring to nobility, upwardly mobile. They're engaging in a venal system for patronage as well. It's generally accepted. Fencing is a part of that. Fencing is needed. You need to display this. You have to be a great rider. You have to be a great dancer. Conversation needs to be good. We haven't had time to talk about Etienne Binet, who wrote in the early part of the 17th century an etiquette guide to conversation, so you don't look stupid when the conversation comes up at court. Fencing is part of that. Fencing is very
Okay.
famously part of that. This is what you need to know about fencing, even if you don't know about it, so you don't look like an idiot from the sticks who's a country bumpkin. But these people are aspiring to it, so they want to fence. And fencing masters, and again, I'd refer you to Croix Le Feu, this French text. They're continuing in Paris, on and on and on. And France, of
Okay.
course, is famous for fencing. The first two Olympics are won by the French. They are promoting French fencing in 1896 and 1900,
Yeah.
I think. There's a whole row, incidentally, between historians at the time about the superiority of the French fencing school and the Italian fencing school. There's a row between a guy called Jacopo Gelli, who calls a guy Egerton
Yes.
Castle an idiot. Yeah, it's
He was
wonderful. And
the
then
curator of the Torino of the Armeria Reale, I think.
yeah,
The
he was
yeah.
incensed by him and by Egerton Castle, and a guy called Vincent Arston. I've forgotten the guy's name now. That's terrible now. but the great French writer on this, and an Englishman, writer wrote in return, said this Italian didn't know, there was stuff like that, and the French writer said, well, the Italians were, it's idiotic what they were doing, these people like Marozzo and stuff like that. Huge ongoing rows between the fences, some of which we're still seeing passed down today. Some of these writings are still influencing historians today. But, we see these traditions going on. The pride, the Italian pride today, is born in that 19th century. Quite rightly, this fantastic legacy was going on in the Italian fibre tradition. The same in France, and quite rightly, there's a lot of Germanic traditions and so on that I think people are proud of now. But it seems quite clear that certainly in France, that pride in fencing continues through. I must mention, Spain as well, in Verdadera Destreza, it dies out in theory, but there's still a lot of pride in the 19th century on the Spanish traditions.
Yeah, there's a cusp of where it's positive and pleasant before it becomes that nationalistic kind of school division you mentioned before that's a little more dangerous or
there's some really
unproductive.
interesting work. Daniel Jacquet, who I may have mentioned, he's just done a paper on this, on some of the Germanic nationalism that's coming on. I'm very interested to see how some of the 19th century Italian authors post-reunification start to allude to this thing. And I think we're obviously digressing quite heavily, but one of the real problems I found engaging with the history is a lot of people reuse 19th century and early 20th century histories, which when you start to dig at it and get to grips with the primary sources, are really badly out. And it's a real problem because these 19th century sources are still very available.
Yeah.
And so the errors are sort of being reborn and carried through into modern day, and it's a problem because academics are quite an insular group. We will talk people's ears off to death, as you've had to suffer already. But we're not in mainstream HEMA in some ways. We don't have that visibility, and so a lot of the 19th century stuff that's freely available on the web is being regurgitated. I mean, Egerton Castle and Jacopo Gelli really have got they're great in terms that they've highlighted stuff and kept it alive. They've got some real problems.
Yeah.
You're better to start with people like Daniel Jacquet, Sidney Anglo even, and Eric Burkhardt, the modern historians who've been looking at this.
Yeah, and maybe one of the risks of these texts is that they feel old enough to kind of be the discovery or something authentic or more connected to the past, but in reality, they're very flawed. And by the way, James Elmsley agrees on one of your suggestions for the talk, so we'll try and see if we can get people on that you suggested. Before we go, then maybe because you opened a lot of doors to possible upcoming talks, I think, even if you're available again.
I'd love to. Yeah.
You mentioned one of the, I think you're currently working on, or is fencing families. So do you want to quickly kind of tease what it is that you're researching?
Yeah, so I mean, the work I've done to date has been sort of very much fight book translations, and I'm moving away from that. So I did, I think with the Book of Lessons, I also did The Free Master of Arms by Charles Bernard, if I can just pimp myself here. And if you look me up on academia, you'll see links to all that. But what I've really got interested in, I think mainly because a lot of the errors I found is about fencing families. So I've been looking at Cavalcabot and how that family moves from Cremona to Bologna to Rome, and then how the wider family is involved in fencing and how they do stuff. I'm also looking at Vigiani. I've got a lot of primary material, which I'm quite excited about because it's refuting some of the standard stuff that people are still saying about that. And so I'm looking very much at the French courts as well, the fencers there, who they were and go on. And I'm also looking at the Medici court at the moment. So people like Altoni, Monesi, their families, and how they interacted with the court. And lastly, I'm looking at the fencing masters of the Habsburgs. So Maximilian I, Ferdinand II, Charles V is a nightmare because his primary documents are scattered across Europe, literally. I'd like to do more on some of the Spanish guys like Carranza, Pacheco, Pablo Paridi as well. So I'm taking these fences and I am looking at their treatises, but I'm looking at their families, because we tend to ignore the women in these things.
That's
Well,
what I was about to ask, in fact.
This is you're not going to have a fence unless you've got a mum, to speak the bleeding obvious. But who they're marrying is very interesting. The cavalcaboes, the females who they're marrying, is really interesting in terms of patronage. Who the brothers are getting into. So looking at the brothers and sisters, the uncles, all of that, and where they're going to, because whilst you've got people like Fabris, who was quite self-motivated, he was very interested in promoting himself, and he as far as I'm aware, didn't appear to marry or have children. People like the Cavalcaboes, the Tedeschis, other fencing families, they're moving between courts and they're marrying, they're having kids. Kids are coming on and taking this on, and you start to branch out. And the lovely thing about that is you start to see insights into their daily lives. And if it's not too much of a side anecdote, there's a will I've got recently of a fencer, and he spent a lot of time, his wife predeceased him, and he was actually at a royal court. I'm not going to say what, that's going to have to come out with the publication, but his wife predeceased him, and he's left with 3 daughters who he's got to raise as well. And he's very worried about getting them dowries that they can marry well. But his 3rd daughter's blind and has impediments. And he spends a long time in the will just sorting through legally, how can I make sure that my daughter is safe, is okay, and be brought up? And for me, I know for Hema it's possibly not that exciting, but it really brought a man's life to life. You show the human side, and to know he was also teaching at court, and he's involved teaching pages as well as some royalty in this case, excuse me. The pressures on him whilst he's doing this is really quite fascinating. And that's basically what I'm working towards. And I'm hoping we can then get a bit more of an understanding of how people lived, as well as helping patronage studies, learning about the courts, and indirectly learning about the fencing. That's my project for the next few years.
Looks like a very interesting one. I think it's really, this is something that already came out in the previous talk about Godinho, and it's how the text itself, like we tend to look at just the techniques and the style and build these kind of schools around simply a list of prescriptions, but perhaps the real school is in the people around the fencer, the family, the relations and interactions. So absolutely, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, almost rounding off, compare Thibaut to Fabris, compare those treatises that Thibaut talks about him. Thibaut, the great humanist, who's interested in the proportions of the body and how that reflects the universe and so on. Fabris, he's been involved in duels. He's been involved, he's a bit of a scrapper. He's known for getting in trouble. Their characters come through the text, but knowing more about them, knowing their surroundings, really does show what they're bringing not only to courts, but what they're intending through their treatise. In my opinion, others will challenge that.
Sounds like a interesting avenue to research for sure. So I think with that, we have a lot of topics to discuss next time. We went a little overboard, but I think it was worth it. So thank you for your time, Rob, and you're welcome, of course, anytime again. And good luck with your family research then.
Lovely. And please, guys, check out those other historians I mentioned, because they're all fabulous. I must say, also, whilst I'm on there, Jacob Deacon, as well as another guy to check out. He's going to come out with some really brilliant stuff on fencing. So please read widely. Thank you very much for having me on and just bearing with me.
Cool. Okay. Wait, we have one last comment here by James Elton again. Can't help think that families' relationships have parallels to chess, talking about the families of armors. Yeah. That's an area needing, yes, absolutely. In fact, the Misaglia came to mind as you were talking about the role of women and everything. Okay, thank you again. If you want to send me the list of names you mentioned, just so I put them in the description so people can, yeah, perfect. Have a nice evening, everyone, and feel free to add any questions in the comments, and hopefully we can figure them out asynchronously. So thanks again, Rob, and have a nice evening and weekend.
You too, mate. Thank you very much.
You.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh.